department established this annual seminar in its honor. It has been a tradition that our graduate students propose the speaker for this lecture. And I wanted to thank our student for such an excellent suggestion. The 2021 annual TK Cheung Lecture in Animal Science will be presented by Dr. Temple Grandin. We are very grateful, Dr. Grandin, for accepting the invitation and for being with us today.
Well, it's really great to be here by Zoom.
Yeah.
And today I'm going to talk about basic animal handling. And
Professor Grandin, I really don't like to interrupt, but I wanted to say something more about you as well.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. That's
all
okay.
Right.
Yeah. So I will give you a voice like in a few seconds. So Dr. Grandin is a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. She's a very well recognized scientist, livestock specialist, animal behaviorist, advocate for human treatment of livestock, innovator, and a recipient of numerous prominent academic and industry awards. She's done extensive work on the design of handling facilities, which she will be talking about today. And this is really worth to mention that half the cattle in US and in Canada are handled in equipment she has designed for the meat plants. Dr. Grandin consults with companies in animal welfare, and she develops several animal welfare guidelines that are followed by the meat and food industry. Dr. Grandin has published several hundred industry publications, book chapters, technical papers on animal handling, plus many referred journal articles, in addition to 12 best-selling books. Dr. Temple Grandin is an autistic person who achieved enormous success in not only in animal science, but also worldwide now outspoken advocate of the autism rights and neurodiversity movements. Dr. Grandin has been featured on major media programs, has been written up in Times, People magazines, Forbes, New York Times. She also has a very popular TED Talks. In 2010, Dr. Grandin was honored in the Time magazine's the 100 most influential people in the world. And most likely, she's the only animal scientist who was portrayed in a biopic movie. The movie Temple Grandin received several nominations and awards and was very well received worldwide. Today, Dr. Grandin will present the lecture Handling Cattle, Pigs, and Sheep at Meat Plants. After the lecture, audience will have some time for conversation with Dr. Grandin. Please use the chat function and address it to me, Rogiewicz. Please introduce yourself, type your question, and you will be later asked to unmute your microphone, turn on camera and introduce yourself and talk to Dr. Grandin. Please join me in welcoming Professor Temple Grandin.
Thank you. Thank you for the really nice introduction. It's great to be here by Zoom. Absolutely wonderful. And I'm going to talk about some basic animal handling. And one of the bright spots in the industry is handling has really improved over the years. This is one of the things that's gotten better. And this picture here on my first slide shows some pigs in the stockyards or the lairage at the correct stocking density. So all of the pigs have room to lay down. Now, it's really important to be a good observer of things. The next slide shows some shadows on a cattle crowding pen. And you can put the next slide up. And those shadows can sometimes change with time of day. One of my students, Dennis Wilson, has just finished up a study, and he found that sharp shadows like this, where they're very sharp, are more likely to make cattle balk than fuzzy shadows that you might have on a cloudy day. The next slide I have shows reflections going into a stainless steel stunning box. And changing the position of the lights can have a big effect. Also, you need to make sure as the cattle come into this stunning box, they're not seeing out onto the processing floor and seeing all the people and all the movement. That's going to cause difficulty getting them in. Now, one good feature on this box is it has a really good non-slip floor. That's important, really important. The next slide shows some very strange shadows that were on our campus on the sidewalk. And these shadows happened during an almost total eclipse of the sun. And you can see that the trees acted as little pinhole cameras. I watched lots of students walk over these and they did not see it. I saw these shadows. I didn't know eclipses made weird shadows. I noticed it. Be a good observer. What are your animals looking at? Animals will often look right at a distraction. They'll often look right at it, or they'll put their head down. Now, the next slide shows a very sharp shadow going into a meatpacking plant. And in this situation, this animal might be afraid of its own shadow. You can see its own shadow and see it move. Also, at a point where you have a sharp shadow, you can sometimes have the animal just stop and put the head down. Wait for that animal to lift the head back up before you try to drive it. Give it an opportunity, take a look, then lift the head back up. The next slide shows wide angle vision. Cattle can see all the way around themselves without moving their head. There's a small blind spot in the back and a small area of depth perception. But to use their depth perception, they need to put that head down and take a look. And that leader might take 15, 20 seconds to take a look, wait for that head to come back up, then you can push them. The next slide shows some animals going through a raceway, and calm animals are easier to handle than scared, frightened animals. And if an animal gets really agitated and frightened, it's going to take 20 minutes for it to calm back down again. So give it time to calm back down. The next slide shows some signs of fearful, stressed animals. And fear is a correct scientific word that's been documented in the neuroscience literature for years. So signs that animals are getting upset are tail switching, pooping, defecating. Maybe somebody could turn their mics off that's got it on. If animals are vocalizing because somebody's poking them with an electric prod, that's a sign of bad handling. And when you see eye white, then your animal is really getting stressed. The next slide lists some of the things that can make animals balk and make animals difficult to move through a facility. Shadows, we already discussed that. Reflections, seeing people. If you have air blowing in the face towards your animals, when the ventilation changes, they may refuse to enter the plant, and then you need to change your ventilation. A coat hung on a fence or a little piece of plastic hanging down. These are all things that can make animals balk. Next slide just shows walking up a main alleyway. And in this situation, those fans are turned off, but sometimes the wind will turn the fans. That can cause them balking. You can also see some reflections on water. Now, one good feature in this slide is that they can see light through here. They're not going into a dark place. Animals don't like to go into a dark place. They can see light there at the end of the tunnel through the side of the building. That's actually good. The next slide shows how I can change something. For example, air blowing out through the restrainer entrance, and then I fix that. And then I have less cattle vocalizing because there was less use of electric prods. And it's really important to measure handling. How many animals did you use an electric prod on? How many animals fell down during handling? How many cattle are mooing in the stunning area? That's a sign of stress, but you can measure. Here's before I made the change. Here's the improvement after I made the change. You need to get down in the chute and see what the animals are seeing. That's my next slide. It just says, get down in the chute, see what they're seeing. So the next slide after this, I'm going to just ask you, what do you see in this photo? Well, there's a styrofoam coffee cup there in the chute, in the raceway, and that can make an animal balk. There's a little piece of red string. Now, if you bring your animals up calmly, they'll look right at that thing. They'll look right at it and show you the stuff that you need to remove. They'll notice little things that move. The next slide shows a pig looking up the race, going up to the stunner, and he's looking at reflections on dripping water. So I either need to get rid of the dripping water, or I change the lighting so you don't have the dripping water. Let's go to the next slide. shows a little sun streak and a shadow. Now on a cloudy day, you won't see that shadow. It will be gone. The next slide shows some pigs stopping where the floor is going from concrete to metal. See, wherever you have a change in flooring, animals will tend to stop. And it would be best to have the flooring all the same. Let's go to the next slide. This shows a situation where maybe adding some solid sides to this ramp would be really helpful. Also, you can see the shadow of the person. I've had a situation where I was moving cattle and my own shadow of me moving around was causing the animals to stop. Now, the next slide shows the effect of just using solid barriers. The whole bottom part of this gate, about 2 feet or half a meter of the bottom of the gate, is just a plastic curtain made from conveyor belting. So if you close that on the pigs, it's not going to hurt them. And the pigs don't know it's a curtain and they don't try to walk through it. The other slide, all that's holding the sheep in is a curtain made out of cloth. And that's all that's holding them in. That's the power of using behavior. We want to use behavior to handle animals and not force. Let's go to the next slide. This just shows where an entire gate is a curtain. It's just made out of a curtain. And then if someone closes that on the pigs, it's not going to hurt them. The next slide shows some animals coming up to the entrance, and they can see through the side. They can see people walking in and out of the maintenance shop. And to fix this, I simply added some steel panels, which you can see on the next slide. Very simple fix. Lots of times in animal handling, you can do something simple. So you might want to experiment with pieces of cardboard. Obviously, you have to replace that with metal, but you can just try big pieces of cardboard and see if that improves the handling, covering something up. Let's go to the next slide. Show some very bad reflections on the floor of a single file chute or single file raceway. And all I did to fix this, because the pigs constantly backed up, is I moved a ceiling light over about a meter, and that fixed the problem. It's amazing what you can do with lighting to fix problems. I've done a lot of work with improving animal welfare at meat plants, and this particular place had failed many customer audits because the pigs kept backing up. I moved the lights. This reflection went away. The next slide shows a pig stopping at a metal strip. You know, the animals tend to stop wherever there's a change. Now, this is right in the unloading area. Now, another problem that we're running into more and more is I've got the meat plant or the abattoir completely fixed, but there's a lot of animals coming in that are very difficult to handle. They are lame. They are weak. I'm very concerned about what I call biological system overload, where we're pushing the animal's biology too much. We're having some problems now with fed beef. They're heavier at a younger age. They've been genetically selected for more meat. They're being fed almost no roughage. And then if you use too many growth promotants, you're just pushing it. And there's been some problems with pigs too. And in order to have good animal welfare and good handling, I've got to have an animal that's easy to handle. That's really important. The next slide just shows adding a light to the entrance of a restrainer system. Animals do not like going into the dark. So I simply added a light to light up the way. Sometimes the simplest changes make a difference. The next slide shows some more data where I collected data on electric prod use before I added the light. And then I collected data on electric prod use after the light was installed. And these were people were well-trained handlers, and they only used the electric prod on the pigs that refused to move. The other thing you've got to do is get electric prods out of people's hands. It's not your primary driving tool. And in most places, the only place you might need it a little bit is at the entrance to the stun box. The next slide just talks about the importance of experimenting. I've gone into a lot of plants with a portable light, lots of cardboard, and some duct tape, and some zip ties. And I'm amazed at simple things I can do to improve handling. And then, of course, you need to replace it with permanent things. The next slide shows a restraint box. and a barrier has been installed so that an animal going into this restraint box does not see activity on the floor. You know, there still are places where they expect an animal to put its head through a head holder, and those animals can see out onto the processing floor. But you also need to make sure it's well lighted, because he's not going to put his head into a black hole that gets the dark movie theater effect. The next slide just shows a situation where this should work quite well because they're heading towards the light. But animals will not go towards blinding light, like looking right into the sun. They tend to move towards the light, but not blinding light. The next slide shows a head holder that looks like a dark hole. That does not work. And my next slide shows a head holder that's lighted really well. They can just see a lighted way at the end of the tunnel. That often really works well. The next slide, it brings up an issue that's getting more and more of an issue because a lot of cattle are getting much taller these days. And you have to make sure that the door on the entrance to the stun box opens up high enough so that they don't bump their backs on it. They need and if they think they're going to bump their backs on it, they're going to stop. Sometimes I've just fixed the door so it'll raise up another, few little bit, and they'll go in. The next picture shows back bruises on a Holstein steer. This is from the trucks. These animals are getting taller and bigger. And some dairies, fortunately now, are realizing that maybe some of these cows are just too big. Maybe you just breed a smaller cow, then it's going to fit in the truck. This brings up another important thing in design. Do I change the truck, or I change the animal I put on the truck? And as I mentioned before, I'm getting very concerned about weakness in animals. And years ago, I did a really stupid project. This is back when I was young and stupid in my early 30s. And I thought that I could fix problems with pigs that were lame with conveyor belts in the floor. It doesn't work. I had to go back and tear some of this stuff out. If animals have difficulty walking, maybe we need to change the genetics, change the way we feed them, or make sure an old dairy cow is marketed when she still can walk. Let's go to the next slide. This shows a very nice little facility where the whole facility's outside. So when they go into the stun box, it may look too dark. You might want to put a shade over this so it doesn't look so dark inside the plant. Let's go to the next slide. And this shows the dark movie theater effect. Really bright outside, really dark inside. And this kind of a problem is going to be a biggest problem on really bright sunny days. At night, this is going to work fine. You just light it up inside at night, it's going to work great. Cloudy day, it'll probably work really well. On a sunny day, it's going to have problems. The next slide, it's about electric prods. An electric prod should never be your primary driving tool. Get it out of your hand. You can have it someplace where you can pick it up quickly if you need it, but it's not a primary driving tool. The next slide just shows a really nice flag for moving pegs. And I really like this flag because you can also hold it with a handle in the middle. It has two handles, one in the middle and one on the end. This is some of the nice, clever things that plants have come up with. Also, this particular plant has a really nice floor, non-slip flooring. And one of the problems you can have with flooring is that flooring slowly wears out. And it wears out and you don't realize it. And I call that bad becoming normal. And this is why it's important to measure handling. And if I measure slips and falls, then I can tell, well, maybe the floor's wearing out, or maybe the people are getting too aggressive with the driving aids. It's important to measure handling. And this is part of the North American Meat Institute Animal Handling Guidelines. You measure stunning. You measure how many are insensible, hopefully all of them. Measure prod use, measure slipping and falling, and measure vocalization. The next slide just shows a really nice little flag for moving livestock. Now, the mistake that people make with driving aids is they get way too aggressive with them. No, just use it like this to just move it. Don't be in there waving it. Let's go to the next slide. shows a picture of me using a driving aid to turn an animal in a crowd pen. And another really important thing is moving small bunches of animals. Don't jam the crowd pen full. And my next slide just shows a nice little flag on a paddle for moving pigs. People have gotten really creative in some of their driving aids. Now this next slide shows a thing called the witch's cape. And this is good for moving really big groups of pigs, like out of a pen. And an issue that came up in the United States, I want to bring up in this next slide, is we had our meat inspectors shut a plant down because they said the plant was beating the pigs with a paddle. So when does just tapping an animal with a paddle become actually beating an animal? And there was a big giant fight over this. So I have a video you can look up online. It's called Proper Use of Livestock Driving Tools. Proper Use of Livestock Driving Tools. And when a cardboard box starts to break, an empty cardboard box, I whack it with a paddle. And when it starts to bend and break, then tapping has become beating. Because in most of our industry guidelines, both the US and Canadian, there are certain things that are egregious acts of abuse, which are absolutely not allowed, like dragging live downers, beating up animals, poking them in sensitive areas. These are things that are acts of abuse. The next slide shows a list of the acts of abuse. And these are things that a meat inspector or a customer, these are absolutely never acceptable. There's certain things you don't do. And in your Canadian guideline for feedlots, they now have a category called egregious acts of neglect. One would be letting your cattle run out of water in a feed yard. You know, it's something where you neglected something, or you've got heifers calving in the feed yard, and that's something I want to try to avoid. But if you have heifers calving in a feed yard, you've got to assist those heifers and you've got to take care of those calves. Otherwise, you have an egregious act of neglect. Let's go to the next slide. This shows going into a CO2 stunning machine using power gates. Power gates must never, ever knock animals over. You knock animals over with power gates, that's dragging. No, in the US rules, you can be shut down for that. All right, the next slide talks about the importance of using behavior. And most of your animals that you get are not completely tame. So they have some flight zone where you enter the flight zone and the cattle, the pigs, or the sheep will move away. You have the point of balance. You have natural following behavior. Animals also have a tendency to go back to where they come from. These are some of the principles of animal behavior that people handling animals need to understand. Flight zone, they move away. Pressure zone, you probably noticed in some of my pictures that the cattle will turn around and look at you. That they know you're there. Some people call that the zone of influence or the zone of awareness. These things have a lot of different names, but there's basically two zones. There's the flight zone where they move away, and there's zone of awareness where they know you're there. They'll turn and look at you. Point of balance right here at the shoulder. A big mistake I see people making all the time is they'll stand in front of an animal when he's in a single file shoot or a single file race, and they tap it on the button, try to get it to go forward. No, you got to be behind the point of balance at the shoulder. And then you want to use your natural following behavior. If the animals are following, then just sit there and watch them go in. You don't need to be waving your arms. And then they also want to go back to where they came from. The next slide shows the flight zone, and you can see how it's like a bubble. And there's some handling specialists that talk about the bubble and how you can stand in just the right position in the bubble and the animals will flow around you. And if you have completely tame animals, then you don't have any flight zone at all. And then on the next slide shows flight zone, and you can see a dotted line there that represents a single file race. And it shows the gray area is the flight zone. And then the dotted line is that pressure zone or zone of influence where they know you are there. And I have a new book that's come out called The Slaughter of Farmed Animals, Practical Ways of Improving Animal Welfare, and it's got all these diagrams in it. Also, all of these diagrams are on my website, Grandin.com, just my last name, Grandin.com. My website will also have these diagrams. And we'll go to the next slide. And point of balance is usually at the shoulder. Most, the meat packing plant, it's at the shoulder. But if you want to get an animal to go forward, don't stand in front of it and tap it. That's not the thing to do. Now, the next slide shows an animal rearing up in a single file race. And the reason why that animal is rearing is because the person is too close. That person's inside the flight zone. That animal wants to get away. So what you need to do is just back up and get out of the flight zone. Just back away, get out of the flight zone, and then it'll calm down. But the big mistake that people make is try to push it back down. That is not the thing to do. We'll go on to the next slide. Now here is a very useful little movement method to get animals to go forward in a chute. And it's kind of counterintuitive. But what you do is you quickly walk back by the animal in the opposite direction. And when you quickly pass the shoulder, they go forward. Try it. It works. You quickly walk back by them. And this is one of the things that you can use that can help you, greatly help you to reduce the use of electric prods. We'll go on to the next slide. This just shows using this movement pattern in a curved chute, and you walk back by them, and then you return just outside of the flight zone. You know, these are really useful things to teach people. The next slide shows the importance of moving very small groups of animals. People always want to bring up more animals. Good handling requires more walking. And years ago, I figured out that 5 pigs was the correct amount of pigs to bring up from the farm to load. It is still the correct amount of pigs today. And they're really big today. So maybe you want to only bring 3 or 4 up at a time. It's going to take more walking. But it's a mind, you have to change the people's thinking that you're not going to run out if this facility looks half empty. You also want to use the following behavior. You want to wait until your single file's got space in it. So you can bring those animals up and then they can just keep on going. They've actually bringing these animals up a bit too soon. And you can see in the crowd pen that some of those cattle have already turned around on you. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide shows perfect operation of a crowd pen. They waited until there was space in a single file, and then they just bring them up and they just keep them going. Using that following, they want to go back to where they come from, using that following, and then they go right to the crowd pen. Also, your man there in the purple shirt is standing back so that he's not in the flight zone. You don't want to be driving pigs or cattle or sheep into people. The next slide just shows some animals, they may be brought up too soon. Some have turned around. But the good thing in this slide is they're not trying to push too hard with the crowd gate. Lots of times you don't even need to use the crowd gate. You know, you need to sort of treat it like the emergency brake. You only use that crowd gate when you have an animal that doesn't want to move. Now, sheep, you can move, and the next slide shows sheep. And there is a species difference. Sheep, you can move in continuous flow. You can just move in one great big continuous flow. Where cattle and pigs, you want to move in small separate bunches. That's the difference between sheep, which go in continuous flow, and cattle and pigs. The next slide just shows some really nice following behavior of sheep. And if they're just following, you don't need to be touching them. Now, the next slide shows the importance of having a non-slip floor. Really good non-slip floor. And there's various mats that you can get that are available now from 2 or 3 different companies. Okay, I want to see if you're a good observer. This slide's talking about non-slip flooring. And if you were here live in the classroom, I'd say, well, how many of you saw that animal is looking at the sunbeam? I show this slide to elementary school children. Half the hands go up. Little kids still think in pictures. Animals don't think in words. Yeah, I asked school administrators, almost no hands go up. But he's obviously now looking right at the sunbeam. I can't emphasize enough the importance of non-slip flooring. The next slide just shows a grating made out of metal rods. And if you choose to go with this type of non-slip floor, you've got to put the rods so they butt like this. Never do it like that. They'll break their toes off. The metal grating has to lay flat on the floor. The next slide shows a really nice concrete floor, grooved concrete floor for cattle. The next slide shows a nice stamped pattern of concrete where you stamp a metal mesh pattern into the floor. Works really well for sheep and pigs. And then my student, Helen Klein, went out in the middle of the night to get pictures of cattle out in the stockyard, so fed cattle at a great big plant. We'll go on to the next slide. And that there's too many cattle in that pen. There's no way they can lay down and rest. Way too many cattle. Now I'll show you one that's got the right amount of cattle in it. She took these pictures at 3 o'clock in the morning with a GoPro she tied to a catwalk that she triggered with a phone. And that's got too many cattle. And the next slide shows just the right amount of cattle. And you can see they've got room to lay down. This is especially important if the animals are spending the night at the plant. And then for pigs, you always want to have enough space for those animals to lay down. And for your best meat quality, and we'll show the next slide's got pigs in it, they need 1 to 2 hours of rest in the pen. I'm not talking about the loading and handling time, but actually in the pen to lay down and calm down, and that will help the meat quality. Next slide shows a really good concrete ramp with stair steps, but you'll also see how that animal is avoiding walking on the reflection there. Really good ramp, really nice floor, nice stair step ramp. Now I'm going to show you some tips on designing ramps. This next slide talks about the wrong cleat spacing. If the cleats are too far apart, the animals will slip. If the cleats are too close together, the foot will run over the top of it. The next slide shows a spacing for the cleats that's just right. The hoof will just fit down in there. The next slide shows one that's too close together. Then the feet tend to go over the top of it. And my next slide shows cleats too far apart. Then your feet tend to slip in between the cleats. My next slide here shows the correct angle for designing a crowd pen for cattle and sheep. The correct angle, one side straight, the other side on a 30-degree angle. And also in my books, I've got a lot more designs. I have a book on humane livestock handling, and it's got a lot of designs for both small plants and big plants and shows how to lay this out correctly. The next slide shows this is wrong. You lay it out like this, it'll be a jammed up absolute mess. It will not work. Also, a lot of these designs are on my website, grandin.com, where they're free. And the next slide shows a design for pigs. Cattle and sheep will work well with a funnel. Pigs don't. Pigs jam. So a real simple little design is just an offset step to prevent the pigs from jamming. The next slide shows a simple lameness scoring system. We've got a lot of animals coming into the plants now that are lame. And it's due to a variety of things: leg conformation, feed additives, fed too much grain, young and fat and heavy. And the other thing that's been found out on this is that there's a big feedlot effect. The people that work at the plants know who has the really bad cattle that lay down, don't want to get up. I'm talking feedlot cattle here. Schwarzkopf-Gens, one of your Canadian researchers, found a big feedlot effect on lameness. Well, the people that work at this plant, they have not nice names for these feed yards. I'm not going to repeat them because they're swear words. But the thing I want to emphasize is that most producers are bringing in animals that are good livers. We've been having some problems with congestive heart failure in cattle. And what they're finding, like when you go look at the viscera on the gut table, is most of the cattle are just fine. And then they bring the rubbish in on the night shift when the managers have gone home. And there's certain feed yards that do this. And I'm going to call those feed yards a significant minority. I want to make it very clear, it's not the majority of the industry, but there's a significant minority, maybe 15% of them or so, that are bringing in feedlot cattle that are difficult to handle and pigs that are very difficult to handle. And another big thing that will affect this in pigs is if that producer never walks his pens, pigs are going to be horrible to handle. And some of the most dangerous cattle to handle at a plant have only been handled on a horse, and they see the first person walking at a plant. That gets very dangerous. Flight zone, it gets really big. Now, here are some of the handling problems we've got to correct on the farm. On the next slide, lame animals. We've already talked about that. I've been almost killed by cattle handled with dogs. There are a few people that are raising grass-fed beef. They let them go feral for 3 years. They've never been handled, and they're very dangerous to handle at the plant. And then you've got these animals, only seen a man on foot. I saw some of those in Canada. The flight zone was 5 times bigger to the person on foot compared to the person on the horse. And that gets very dangerous in a small pen at a packing plant or at an auction. Now, I just want to show you a few layouts, and these designs are in my books. They're also on my website. And the next slide shows a basic cattle or sheep layout that takes advantage of the natural tendency of the animals to want to go back to where they came from. That's on my website, and it's in the Humane Handling book. The next slide shows a real simple little design where you just work from the crowd pen pivot. Got a solid outer side on it. The next slide shows a good layout for a small plant. Getting a lot of interest now in small plants. After COVID, we had a horrible mess with the pigs that had to be killed on the farm, 300,000 pigs killed on the farm, total mess. I've had many beef producers come and approach me about smaller plants. You know, people are realizing big is fragile. Now, big when it works is really good. It's real economical. We can have very good welfare. We can have very good food safety, but when it breaks, and I've been following this mess with the container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. That's another example of big as fragile. And you know what? She's got some even bigger sisters. They're even bigger than that one. And all of these ships are only 3 years old or less. Maybe we shouldn't have ships that big going in that canal. We've got to really start thinking about big is fragile. And the paradox we've got is that if I distribute the supply chain, it's going to be more expensive. But if I break one of the things, or less, whether it's a cargo ship or whether it's a plant, it doesn't disrupt the whole supply chain. No, I'm glad they got that boat out of there. Now they have to find out if she's damaged. Well, they got to haul her with tugs. Right now they're doing that and see if she can continue her trip, or does she have to go to the next port and have the containers all unloaded? 9,000 containers, the size of a truck. It's called 20,000 20-foot equivalents, which are half-size containers. That's a lot of trucks, so they got to unload that thing. They still don't know yet whether she can continue to her destination or is she damaged. I've been following this right now because it's an example of big is fragile. And there are a lot of shipping people that are gonna really want her big sisters that are even bigger. All right, let's go on to the next slide. This nice little small locker plant. And here's another slightly bigger locker plant. These drawings have gotten very popular during COVID. We've really got to think about supply chains. Pharmaceuticals have a very narrow supply chain. I've been looking at supply chains for vaccines. There's some tiny little filter they use that's hard to get. There's some ingredients that are hard to get. I don't know what they are. I haven't been able to find out yet. But these are all things, maybe that stuff's on one of those containers. I don't know. Big, it's fragile. Let's go to the next slide. And here's a nice little restrainer you can make for doing, halal or kosher slaughter. And now I'm going to just show you something you don't want to do in your building because it's a real mess. Show on the next slide. That's a vinyl plastic insulation. Don't use this junk. Every bird in town will tear it out. This particular plant had to rip it all out because every bird in town has shredded it. Not the thing to use. And we'll go on to the next slide. There are my books. And then what we'll do right now, we can just leave that slide up there. And it's time to do questions. And I always like to do questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Grandin. It was very informative, I will encourage students to move forward. Send me a
If
question.
they don't, I'm gonna ask them. I can see names here, and I'm gonna pick somebody. Somebody doesn't get a question. You see, maybe there's something on the chat here. If you want to write them in the chat, just go right ahead. I got the chat up right now. That's how I often do questions.
Yeah. So if you want to, you've got a question. So Professor Grandin, so maybe waiting for questions from students, I would like to ask you for your sort of reflection based on your experience and being really involved in the academia and in industry. What do you think about the progress we have made as an animal scientist or the generally animal industry in terms of the animal welfare over the years?
Well, there's some things that have really improved. Handling has really improved. Stunning has improved. I worked on the McDonald's audits down in the States about 20 years ago, and broken stunners were a huge issue. And we went through these plants. There were 75 plants on the McDonald's approved supplier list. And we just went through them and said, you got to fix broken stuff. And then the equipment companies responded by having testing equipment, by doing training seminars. And we got rid of a lot of broken stunner problems and slippery floor problems and jamming too many cattle into things. And so things have gotten better on the training. That's improved. I'm really, really happy about that. But just as we got that fixed, and this is something that I did back in 1999, and the thing I'm very proud of, there was 75 plants on the US McDonald's approved supplier list in 1999. And I saw more change than I'd seen in my whole career. And only 3 of those plants had to buy expensive equipment. Everything else we fixed with things like maintenance. Stunning was mainly broken stunners. But now I was getting super happy. I got the slaughterhouses fixed. I was super happy. Then about 5 or 6 years later, we started to get in fat cattle with problems. Lameness, somebody just mentioned in the chat there about growth promoters, beta agonists. You go too high a dose of that during hot weather, you will have problems with pigs. And that is in the literature. I've reviewed that literature. But we also are getting some genetic problems. So I can't blame it totally on growth promotants, because some of the issues we've got with lameness, both in pigs and cattle, is leg conformation. And that is genetic. That's not that's not something to do with growth promotants. But we're pushing animal productivity to the point where the animals are starting to have some problems like congestive heart failure. That has a big genetic component. So we're testing for that trait. What we have to start looking at is what is optimal. Because I want to have good cattle handling, but how do I've got cattle coming in that you got to get them up first because they don't want to walk.
Right.
And they bring those in on the night shift, which really annoys me. So they avoid the person who's checking lameness because they know when that person's going to be there. And I'm not very popular when I bring up this whole issue of what I call biological system overload, where we've pushed. And the problem is that this creeps up on you slowly and you do not realize it. I call it bad becoming normal. Then you get used to seeing lame cattle. And there's actually been studies done where they ask a producer, how many lame cattle have you got? 3 different scientific studies, journal articles, refereed papers show that the producer will underestimate by half the amount of lame cattle they have, unless you actually measure it. That's been documented. So these problems creep up on you slowly. And I think we have to start looking at what is optimal. Optimal. We don't want to go back to, let's say, slow growing chickens that take 20% more feed. But then there's a point where you're pushing the chicken so hard, you get woody breast. They've solved a lot of the leg problems, where what happens is the breast tissue is growing so fast that the blood supply gets starved. So then you get a piece of dead tissue in the middle of the breast. There's no food safety issue because it remains sterile. But the chickens have lower activity. Where do you stop? Now, 20% more feed, that's really bad from a sustainability standpoint. But maybe we back off a little bit, maybe 4% more feed. Maybe that's all you have to back off. And then I found that fixing the slaughterhouse was easy. You know, producers don't want to hear that maybe they're pushing these animals too hard. But on the other hand, there's a lot of feed yards doing a really good job that are not doing these things. There's a significant minority that's pushing things way too hard. Okay, here's a question here about noises to avoid moving cattle. Yelling. That is something that needs to stop. There's some Canadian research done years ago by Joe Stuckey and in Saskatchewan, and he found that yelling and screaming at cattle made their heart rate go up more than just machinery noise. Yelling as intense, so yelling at cattle. You know, maybe a little, that's, you know, about all you need to use, and try to just use your body. There's some people teaching low stress handling now that are suggesting no driving aids because people flap their arms around too much. And then as far as growth promotants go, they're only part of the problem because some of the stuff we're getting now has a big genetic component too. Also, there's some irresponsible feeding. There are people feeding cattle almost no roughage. I call it feeding cattle pig feed. They're ruminants. They need to get some roughage. And then the liver abscesses will go away. But they're going for the maximum feed conversion. You see, there's a point where you need to back off just a little bit. I'm not suggesting, because I understand the conflict between sustainability. You want that really good feed conversion. And I don't want to have the feed for chickens go up 20%. That's horrible. I'm saying if I'm at a truck stop and there's 4 big truckloads of feed there and a 5th truck rolls up, that's 20% more feed. That's horrible. But on the other hand, you may need to back off just a little bit. You get the right balance. That's the thing I'm advocating. And yeah, you monitor this stuff at the plant. You better go in there late on the night shift and find out what they're doing, because that's when they do all the garbage. And it's not okay. See, the other thing that you get into with beef is if you've got beef cows out on an extensive ranch, like out here in Colorado, the animal that would make a good feedlot animal doesn't make a very good cow out on the range, too big. I've been reading a lot of stuff from ranchers. And if you've got kind of sparse pasture, you don't want cows that are too big because they eat too much. Okay, here's this an interesting question. On my farm, I normally have calm cattle, but this year during calving, a majority of my cattle turned wild. This never happened before. Our cattle are worked on foot and on horseback. What would turn them wild? That's a real interesting question. I would have to ask a lot more things. Okay, let's just ask some no-brainers. Did you change something you're feeding somehow? Did you change personnel? And maybe somebody's doing something nasty to these cattle that you don't know about. You see, this is where I just have to start asking some questions. You know, something changed. Did you get a new bull? Did you use new semen? I'll tell you about a situation that we had about 5 years ago. I had a steer in my lab, an Angus steer, and he was nuts. Completely nuts. And it was genetic. They tried some new semen. This bull was nuts. This steer was nuts compared to our other cattle. And all of them have been raised the same way. So did you try some new semen? Let's look there. Let's just look at some obvious things. And they never used this semen at our experiment station ever again. I called this animal the time machine, because 25 years ago, I worked on selecting cattle for temperament. My student did some of that first research. And this animal was like something we had 25 years ago, completely crazy. And they had all lived together in the same place. So those are some things you could look at there. How do I tackle a biological overwhelm? Well, there's a bunch of factors that lead to this. And one of the things the packing plants actually have data on who has bad cattle. And let's just go on some of the simple things. 95% grain is not an acceptable ration for beef cattle, period. It's that simple. And the roughage better have some fiber length. You don't make the 5% roughage that big. You know, let's just start with some basics. Also, our Angus Association has been doing leg conformation guidelines now. That's a good thing. They're also doing a thing called the PAP test for the congestive heart failure problem that used to be just called high altitude sickness. So there are some genetic factors here. You see a variety of factors, lead into this. But having cattle, fat cattle at a plant, you have to pre-get up is not okay. But what happens is bad becomes normal. And one advantage of having been around for a long time is I can remember the days when you never pre-got cattle up, when they were fed steers, ever. And you get a young person coming in, they don't even know that that's abnormal. Visual environment. Now, the thing is, my visual environment, sometimes you just remove the simplest things, like I've moved a light, added a light, and then the stun box worked fine. I put up a barrier so that they couldn't see onto the floor. I added put a mat in the box so you have a non-slip floor. Sometimes the simplest stuff make a huge difference. People have a tendency to want to go tear everything up. No, I said, wait a minute. I want to see exactly where the problem is, because sometimes there's a real simple way to fix things. And animals do need to get some rest time. Resting pigs and cattle overnight is not that doesn't help anything. That might be bad. But even cattle need time to settle down. And pigs need at least 1 to 2 hours of rest after unloading. Some of your worst animals for going crazy are their short hauls, 15-minute hauls. And the reason for that is they don't have time to calm down on the truck. Sometimes it's really simple. But the first thing is people have got to calm down. And I can't emphasize enough small groups for cattle and pigs. Good handling is going to require more walking. I asked you in Brandon, is there better ways to hold pigs instead of just a metal wire snare? That's a really good question. And Lily Calloway Edwards, my former student, did a study on that. She found it's very stressful. I saw a very nice restraining chute that Zinpro made for part of their feet forward program for foot trimming of the sows. And the sow just walks in, sort of like a center track restrainer, and just lifts her up, and she doesn't even squeal. Now you'd have to bring the pig to this thing. But unfortunately, snaring is really stressful. Once they've had it once, they never want to do it again. And one thing I would recommend is don't go into a pig's home and snare her. You want her so that when she's, okay, there's a lot of group housing now, don't walk into that group housing and snare the sows. Don't do that. You've got to do that, bring her outside, take her down to the end of the building to a place that's a designated bad place, and you do it there. Then the sow learns that when she's in her home pen, she's not going to be attacked by people. And that even applies to gestation stalls. Don't go into a gestation stall and snare a sow in there. They're attacking her in her house. Don't do that. And animals also can differentiate certain people that do things. They tend to pick up on, maybe safety vests are associated with something bad, these sorts of things. Calm cattle. Okay, we already have to think that wild cattle. The first thing I'm going to look at with wild cattle is semen. Did you try some new semen? Because I couldn't believe this steer I had in my lab. I call him the time machine because he was completely crazy. He was like a throwback to 25 years ago. And all of those cattle have been treated the same. So I would check that out. Yeah, herd blindness. Yeah, this is, or I call it bad becoming normal. It's the same thing. Another thing I'm getting concerned about that I've learned during COVID that I'm getting concerned about, and I don't think people are going to be very happy with me about this. I have a nice monitor. And for years, I have been showing, especially my autism talks, pictures of my old jobs about how I got my business started. Black and white, ancient old pictures. And I was showing them, and I've been showing them in theater type things, but on a really nice monitor. I looked at a picture of my old job from the mid-70s, and I could see pens of cattle in the background. And there weren't very many cattle in those pens. We've doubled the capacity of the pens. It's one of the reasons why they're muddy. I think some people won't be very happy if I take out the pictures where I climbed up the top of the mill in an 80,000 head feed yard. These were big feed yards in the 70s. And the shades we had in the 70s were really nice. But the amount of cattle we put in the pens now wouldn't fit under those shades. And then they're going to be too wide and have mud all under them. No, I'm going, because now I could actually see the cattle that were in the pens around the feed yard on a nice monitor. I couldn't see that before, or I never paid attention to it when I was showing it in a theater. Okay, now however, there's still here, cow calf operation, exploring ways to improve the handling. How do you do cows and calves? Well, I'd recommend, I've got a lot of drawings in this humane handling book where there's a separate, you use the same crowd pen, but you have a separate chute for the calves to go in. A separate chute for them, so they aren't turning around in the cow system. So it's all the same corral. The difference is that you've got a, and maybe show you this, a little separate chute in the same system, because they can go through the same crowd pen that you put the calves in. You know, that's one of the things that you can do. Here's one right here that's set up where it's got a, hope that's clear. It's got a trailer loading ramp, and that's got a little separate chute there for calves. I think that's the easiest thing to do. So you don't have two complete systems. You have one system that's got two chutes coming off the crowd pen. Why are processors not doing their best? I have to get more detail to answer that. Handling a bison, I'll tell you one thing you don't do with them. Line them up in a single file chute, make them wait like cattle. No, bison, you're better off bring one or two up at a time, one in the box, shoot it, roll it out. Then you put another in the box, shoot it, let it sit there, get those hoisted and done, and then you bring another two up. Don't queue them up in single file chute. Open housing for sows, it's going to be the way to go. And the thing is, you have to have the right pig genetics. There are some really mean, nasty hybrids that tail bite, they fight, they're just awful, and they're not fit to live together. And these pigs originally got bred in the 80s, and they were breeding for three traits: rapid growth, gigantic loins, and thin back fat. And they ended up picking out pigs that were aggressive at the feeder and bad tail biters. Now, if you keep a sow in a stall, she can't fight. Take her out of the stall and she can fight. And that genetic's not going to work in group housing. And people that are doing group housing and doing it well don't use that genetics. And these are the kind of pigs that when you go into a pen of market pigs, they'll rip your boots. They bite so hard on boots. And I had a chance to go up to Quebec into some very nice group housing, and they just nibble like this. They don't, you know, these other sows would hurt your legs. The ones that aren't fit to live, these would just nibble like that. And they weren't having a problem. You do it, there's certain genetics that won't work. And then the other thing is you've got to have a little higher level of stockmanship. If you're using electronic feeders, then you've got to work on training the gilts. And I went to a really nice Banff seminar about 3 years ago. There was a farm in Nebraska presenting that at first they were real skeptical of loose housing with electronic sow feeders. And they found that they had to get their pig whisperer. And he would come out there at 3 o'clock in the morning at weird hours, very patient and gentle with the gilts, and train them to use the feeders. Okay, here's the question about roping versus chutes. All right, that's a good one. I get it every time. I have seen excellent roping done very low stress. But the problem with roping is it requires a huge degree of skill that most people don't have. So for beginners, I definitely recommend calf temple. But I have seen beautiful roping. I've also seen absolutely horrible roping. And in the 70s, we used to use roping all the time in the feed yards. Now I remember 2 old cowboys, they'd rope a steer, they were so good. Then in the next feed yard next door, I went over there and I watched a guy just run a steer into a fence and kill it. The problem is roping to do it really well is very skill dependent. It's kind of 2 approaches to things. I can have something that's cheap to build. Ropes are cheap. But it requires a huge amount of skill to use them. I also had a client that owned some hotels, and he also owned ranches. And his #1 workman comp claim is accidents during roping. So But for most people today, they don't have the skill to do it right. No, I've seen it done beautifully. It would be less stressful. But for everyone that did it beautifully, there's 5 more that do it terrible. And I can't do it. I'm going to use the calf table. Okay, vaccinations. I'm going to do vaccinations just in the pen. Vaccinations just aren't that bad compared to snaring. Now, the only thing you got to watch out for is some medicines really sting. Okay, like I got vaccinated for COVID. The vaccine didn't sting at all. But I've seen there's some medications and things that really sting almost like a bee. And a lot of other medications, if you use a small, good needles, they don't even hardly feel them. I can go ahead and vaccinate them in the pen. But snaring is much more stressful than, sticking a needle in them. Well, yeah, the thing is, snaring pigs is stressful. An exportation center, I would this foot forward chute that Zimpro made. This is where I thought thinking of putting a chute in the whole thing for some of this stuff, because you're putting so many through. Just line them up, and then it worked like a center track restrainer, and just lift up. The pigs straddling a bar like this, you could lift the sows up and down. They didn't even spoil. No, I'd put that into an export center, because I'm going to have to. No, that's probably what I do. Smaller plants, but the thing that's really stimulating this interest is when we had the crisis with COVID, and the amount of pigs were the worst, because even if and I did a paper on this that's now up online about COVID in the pork industry. The cattle, you can put them on hay or something. You can slow them down. Very few cattle were put down in the U.S. Pigs, 300,000 pigs killed on the farm, or they'd send them to the slaughterhouse and use the stunner to put the pigs down, and then the carcasses either went to landfill or compost. Huge waste of food. Another thing you could do is what I call big pig bits. If you got half the staff in a plant, let's say a great big plant, you just put carcass pork out. You don't have to retool a plant to do that. Don't let someone lie to you. No, and then I'm going to find other people to cut it up. There's plenty of people around to do that. In fact, one of our plants on the East Coast was exporting carcass to China. So on our East Coast, we didn't have to destroy pigs on the farm there. It was the upper Midwest that had the big problem. But the problem is, you always have this balance. See, big is really get that economy of scale. You see, the other thing people are questioning now in things like pharmaceuticals, ingredients, raw materials, is just in time, where you don't have a warehouse full of ingredients. But when it breaks, who knows what's on that container ship? Are they going to have to unload her, or can she continue to her destination? Don't know right now. I got to go back and watch that show. I've been watching it. If she's damaged, they'll have to unload her. It's going to be a mess. If she's not damaged, she'll go on to her destination. And they have to inspect the ship. Tugs have towed her out of the canal. I'm glad they got it out of there. Then I found out about all her big sisters that are even bigger. She's one of the largest container ships in the world, but she's not the biggest. Well, we have a huge need for more small plants. The other thing is small plants can coexist with big plants if the small plants have a niche market. Like here in Fort Collins, we have a gigantic Budweiser beer plant, but we also have little niche breweries. In the emergency, they made hand sanitizer. But when there wasn't an emergency, they made niche craft market beers, and they coexist with Budweiser. You see, you can't compete head to head with the big boy. There's no way. You have to have a niche that the big boy's not going to go into. There's small plants in New Zealand. They call them boutique plants. And they'll do it. And I've been there. I saw those about 4 years ago, where they'll make a 200 box order for some specialized beef or specialized wine. That's their whole business. They're sort of the craft breweries of a meat plant. And they're doing that in New Zealand right now. Okay, animals on ships. I'll tell you something else. Suez Canal, when it got open, they let the livestock ships go first. Glad that they did that. Oil tankers, you wait. Container ships, you wait. Livestock boats go first. They're running out of feed. And this whole business of transporting animals on ships. I'd rather have them processed in the meat plant, and maybe we put refrigerated containers on the ship, or we air freight some of the meat over there. The problem I've got is I don't have backhauls. Okay, you go look up that container ship. Every one of those boxes. Now, she was going to Rotterdam. Well, you can take the Asia Pacific route. I've been kind of getting into supply chain management stuff. That comes China to the US. Clothing, electronics, you name it, it's on that. Okay, masks and protective gear for COVID, things like that in those boxes. Then they got to have a backhaul. I don't want to fill a ship full of empty boxes to send back. I'll tell you what they're backhauling right now: grain and hay for livestock. So a shipping container right now in the US that might be full of electronics may go back with grain or hay in it. But at least that's something for backhaul. You get some of these countries, there's nothing for a backhaul. So, and the thing is, refrigerated containers cost a pile of money. That's my other problem. I can't give those boxes away. Because I was looking into a situation in Australia where I reflexively said, let's just ban the trade of Australian cattle going to Indonesia, let's say. I checked out the backhauls. There's only one: palm oil. That's not very good from an environmental standpoint. I could fill that box up with barrels of palm oil. That's not too great. See, when you really start looking at the whole system, the problem I've got with the Australian outback, I can't grow crops on it. It's the size of half the United States, and I can sustainably raise sheep and cattle on it. Now, I've been to Indonesia. I went there, and someone could say, well, they just put on a show. But what they showed me is it is possible to have decent slaughter in Indonesia with fairly primitive facilities. But they, now here's the thing about trucks stopping. Years ago, I wrote an article in 1997 called Assessment of Stress During Handling and Transport. It was the first article in the journal Animal Science that had the word fear in it. Prior to that, reviewers took that word out of my papers. I had to say they were agitated cattle. I couldn't say they were fearful cattle. Well, fear is a correct scientific word, and I'm now allowed to say fear. And does that stop becoming a stress stop rather than a rest stop? That's something that has to be looked at real carefully. Now I'm thinking about the trips where this is in the days when you could not fly nonstop from the West Coast US to Australia. Now they can, because they changed the routing. But I remember stopping in Fiji. We were locked in customs at 3 o'clock in the morning and not allowed to leave the terminal, walking around this stupid store like zombies. I got thinking about those cattle. Maybe they were having a stress stop. No, that's something that has to be looked at really carefully. Would you be better on different routes when they might be better off just to go on through? It's and it may vary with the season too. No, it's a serious question. And one of your experts is right here in Canada, Karen Schwarzkopf-Genswin. She's a real expert on this. And when I revised my livestock handling book, I invited her to be an author because she's one of the experts on some of this trucking stuff. She found that the experience of the truck driver made a difference because you've got someone who's stomping on the brakes and stomping on the gas. That can throw cattle off balance and be a real problem. No, it's a serious question. And then the other thing is we're getting more and more people attacking meat. Okay, you look at things like the Impossible Burger. I looked at the ingredients list and I'm thinking about, like, if I was head of supply chain management, I got to get all those ingredients. Has everybody actually looked at that supply chain and looked at all the energy inputs? I question that because I'm getting more and more interested in using grazing animals as part of sustainable agriculture to improve land as part of a rotation with crops. Yes, they can audit that with satellites. Oh, I love satellites. Oh, I found this cool satellite company. Same one that took the pictures of the Suez Canal. Coolest website. I can make sure they rotate their crops. Their pictures. They can't mess with that saddle. But we're getting into more and more interesting research where you graze cattle on a cover crop along with your corn and soybeans, and you're going to improve soil health. We use grazing animals to improve land. Ranchers can improve land when things are done right. This is stuff we need to be doing. And the crop rotation we need to be doing. But right now we got economic incentives to dig up everything and raise corn and soy. And it should have a cover crop every third year. Sometimes economic incentives go the wrong way until big breaks. I can tell you, if I was running the Suez Canal, the Ever Given and our big sisters are not welcome. They can go put those boats on the Asia Pacific route. And then if they tip over in a storm or something, you lose a lot of freight, but doesn't mess up the whole transportation system. No, but you see, the other thing on a lot of these issues, people need to get out of the office and see what is actually happening out in the field. I had a very interesting comment from a lawyer that used to work for one of our big livestock companies and grain companies. And he said that his boss made him get out and visit meat plants, visit feed yards, visit all this stuff. He said it totally changed his view. You got to get the suits out of the office. That's what we need to be doing. I don't know how we're doing on time. I can look at my phone and see, oh, well, we still have some time. People still want to ask questions.
Yes, we're doing well, Professor Grandin.
Okay. Okay, we talked about the bison. Well, good. I'm glad you designed something from something I did that worked. Now the thing, are organic animals more difficult to handle? Well, there's nothing about organic that make an animal more difficult to handle, but you've got a few people that think you can just let grass-fed steers go feral. We had some problems with that upper New York state. And so you put steers out on pasture and then you didn't touch them for 3 years, never handle them, then bring them to plant and they're nuts. No, that's not okay. And they probably should have had some vaccinations somewhere along that 3 years. But one thing I'm concerned about in organic is our standards require that if an animal is sick, you should treat it. Well, we got too many sick animals not getting treated. That's not okay. The other interesting thing is the difference between the European organic standards and ours. We have a very big emphasis on prevention of contaminants. Don't want these awful contaminants in it. Europe is more into how does the animal live? Does it have a life worth living? And you're actually allowed to use antibiotics with a longer withdrawal period just for treatment, not for mass. I guess we kind of like those standards. Canada's sort of in between on the two things. No, I think students need to visit farms. I had an interesting comment on my online class. I did my livestock handling class online. And the really interesting comment I had was from a student who lived out on a ranch. And he said, oh, I'm really surprised. We got people in this class who've never been on a farm. And this was a rancher saying that. Yeah, part of the problem we've got today is students are totally removed from the world of the practical. There's a drawing that the students have to do in my class. And I had a girl this semester who had never used a ruler in her life to measure anything. So she was having a lot of problems with the scale drawing. So you've got students totally removed from the practical. I had another student. I asked her how her sandals got here from China. She didn't know what a container ship was. She about fell off the bench. We were on a bench and I showed her a picture of that. They just don't have any idea where anything comes from. And then when stuff breaks, they see the supermarket shelves getting stripped. And we've had some bad storms where that's happened on the East Coast. Now people are getting interested in local. Yeah, because they've seen the shelves stripped. I saw an interview in the paper with one lady, big storm we had on the East Coast, and she went, I wasn't scared until they stripped the shelves at Walmart. Then I got scared. Yeah, I think the Canada, I'd have to look it up. It's in my, I also have just updated my Improving Animal Welfare Practical Approach book. Came out the new 5th edition, and it's got a chart in there in one of my guest authored chapters on the European, the US, and Canadian organic systems. Yeah, biosecurity, that's an issue, especially with pigs. They're terrified of African swine fever. And one of the things that contributed to the amount of pigs that we had to destroy during COVID was China was in the midst of the African swine fever attack, had lost half their pigs. So that revved up our export market. You can see how international markets are interlinked. So, you know, and there's ways to handle biosecurity. I mean, one of the things I would do with a pig farm is if you leave either Canada or the US, I don't want you on my farm for the raised pigs. I want to see your passport. Because if you never leave North America, then you're not going to bring swine fever in. Yeah, I think in Canada, it's something like double the withdrawal. I'd have to look it up. But the thing that's different is that in Canada, you are allowed to use to treat a sick animal. Where in the US, if I treat a sick animal with an antibiotic, I have to pull it off the organic. And then the rules in the US are very strict on organic feed, which gets very, very expensive. And I'm glad your curriculum is getting students out there. And one of the bad things about COVID is trying to do my cattle handling lab as a video. That was bad. And fortunately, in the last class I just did, I was able to do a live lab. And the students really appreciated that. We managed to keep most of our lab stuff in person and put all the big classes online is what we ended up doing. And that worked pretty well. You know what some people have done to deal with our organic really strict standards is that they'll have they'll have two sets of animals, they're organic animals. Then if they have to treat something, the dairies have done this, then they put it over in the regular. As I went to a dairy, organic dairy years ago. Oh, sick calves. Ugh, that was awful. That's not okay. Because you've got to replace those drugs with more management. The other thing is hardier genetics. In other words, cull the beef cows that get lice. You have to get hardier genetics. Live shipping of livestock. I mean, basically, I'd rather not be shipping them on boats. But the problem is when I looked into the Australia thing, and when I first saw it, I said, let's just ban the trade. Then I actually went there. I got in a small plane and flew over the outback, and you don't really understand vastness until you're in a twin engine, it was twin engine, single road, and you just look out over nothing, no electric wires. Then all of a sudden you're at a cattle station that's completely off the grid. Completely. But it had its own cell phone tower. My phone worked there if I stayed at the headquarters. But it was running on a generator. And they would get a delivery truck once a week. And if you had to go to the hospital, they'd stuff you in the back of this airplane and you'd have to stop fuel on the way home at the airplane drive up the credit card gas pump. It's very cute to see that. But if you had a broken leg, that wouldn't be too cute. But that's what they'd have to do with you. And other things, they've got a lot of medical stuff and they would do telemedicine. But that's what they'd have to do with you. Snake bite, they can trade. They've got the stuff there for that.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I wonder if we've got more questions.
Okay, you got another question? I'm just glad that we're getting things.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the US, here's from Megan King. If an animal gets an antibiotic in the US, it loses its organic status, period. And then you see now there's a temptation to not treat, even though our standard says you've got to treat them. But they don't want to take the animal off of organic status. I actually like your regulations better, where you are allowed some limited treatment of individual sick animals. Well, and the other thing that people are getting concerned about is, we can't just be drowning animals in antibiotics. Okay, working cattle with dogs. One of the problems I've run into with that is if you let dogs bite cattle when they're in the single file chute, it teaches them to kick. And then when they go to an auction or a meat packing plant, it's really dangerous. Working cattle with dogs make them more susceptible to coyotes. I know one thing, cattle that have been attacked by wolves, you're not going to work them with dogs. They'll try to kill your dogs. There's also some interesting work they're doing on something called the standing solution. You might want to look that up, the standing solution, where you actually train cattle to turn and face a predator. Then you can forget working with dogs if you've done that. Well, if cattle get used to, I mean, I've seen really good border collies and kelpies do a very nice job of working cattle out in the field, and I do it beautiful. Well, then they'd be used to dogs, but then they probably wouldn't be as afraid of a coyote when they first saw it. The other thing with coyotes is they learn what to eat. So you got one set of coyotes, they're going to eat the ground squirrels and leave the cattle alone. What predators learned, mom teaches her babies what to eat. Now, when you run out of natural prey, this is the issue with wolves, run out of natural prey, then they're going to dine on beef. You have to have enough natural prey.
This is very interesting. So, Professor Grandin, we are also teachers, professors are teachers. So is there anything that we are doing wrong teaching our future animal scientists or future personnel involved in animal industry?
Well, I think we're really going to have to look at ethics, because the view of animal welfare has been changing. Like when I first started, you worked on preventing suffering. Some animal rights group would put out a horrendous video of really bad stuff, and bad handling, things like that. And you got to clean that up. So your first thing is preventing suffering. Then you measure handling. Then you measure lameness, or you measure body condition, or hock swellings on dairy cows. I'm a big believer in measuring these things, and that prevents suffering. And then there's the issue now with behavioral needs, like Tina Wadowski at Guelph has done a lot of work on hens' need for a nest box. But now what's coming up now, what's called Mallore's 5-domain model, is does that animal have a life worth living? Is it having a good time? You want to see some dairy cows having a good time? Look up rotating brush and dairy cow. I'm not supposed to say dairy cows love these brushes, but when you watch these videos, it's obvious that they love these brushes. That would be an example of a positive emotion. Are we giving these animals a life worth living? That's going to come up more and more. A lot of investors are investing in artificial meat and culturing meat, like in big bioreactor vats. I think we have to look at very carefully all the energy inputs into this stuff. But we're going to get more and more and more of these questions. I've designed slaughterhouses. In the future, am I going to be considered evil because I've designed slaughterhouses? Well, years ago, when I was young, I wasn't 30 yet, I got to thinking about maybe someday we won't need slaughterhouses anymore. And when that happens, we will be able to make any kind of life that we want. And in the late 70s, I was feeling really good about, okay, we slaughter beef cattle, we use their pancreas glands to make insulin. We use pig pancreas glands to make insulin. Then the first GMO was invented, and it has nothing to do with grain. It's insulin. It's called rDNA. And they made bacteria grow human insulin. This was the first GMO. It was invented in the late 70s. But in order to get rid of the cattle and the pancreas glands and the pigs and the pancreas glands, they had to make a new form of life. And then during the 80s, they stopped collecting the pancreas glands and the human insulin took over. It was the first GMO. It's a question I'd like to ask students. Absolutely, absolutely. And we now, I got a magazine article, it printed the entire code for the coronavirus. You can send it on a Word document. It's in a magazine. And we're, there's all kinds of stuff we could do. Yeah, we're going to have an ethics issue. It's going to make a slaughterhouse look like a nothing ethics issue. We'll have the power to make any kind of life we want. Maybe we'll have a Microsoft program for design an animal.
Hopefully not.
The design an animal program. No, and that insulin made me really think about that. But the other reason why I'm getting interested in the sustainable agriculture, because I think this is one place where we're going to need animals. Animals created the best cropland we have in Iowa and Illinois. Herds of bison created that land. We need to be getting those grazers back on that land. We use them right, improve soil health. Monoculture wrecks soil health. Every agronomist will tell you that in private. Everyone. I've talked to a bunch of them. No, there's regenerative agriculture, rotating crops. Oh, love this satellite company. Use that. I can use their pictures, and they can't fake the rotating the crops because I got the GPS coordinates too for the fields. And it's also something I directly observe. I'm not a fan of paperwork audits. I've seen too many fake audits. Okay, I've verified you own this land. I have your GPS coordinates, and it's not going to stay cloudy all the time. So I'm going to get pictures of your crops. Don't lie to me. But I think we have to be looking at, there's a place for animals on the land where if you use the cattle correctly, they improve the land.
If I may, we also
do we want to live in a world totally without animals?
If I may, to add something, we also have to remember that quite often animals are the only, feeding animals is the only and best way of recycling certain byproducts of the other industries. Canola meal being an example.
Well,
right?
And the thing is that you see the problem with monocultures, they work great in the short run, but in the long run, they're absolutely terrible. Right now people are going cuckoo right now buying land in the US. I get the Wall Street Journal. I read lots of business stuff. I want to grow corn and soy on it. Well, we need every third year put something else on it. How about a cover crop? And you got to graze that cover crop to make it profitable. And it's very local. What works for cover crop one place doesn't work somewhere else. So you better get real super.
Live session by Temple Learned. No? Yeah.
Okay, somebody wants to ask a question verbally. That's fine.
What? How do I get that? Yeah. Through my prof.
Michael Yankee, could you please mute your mic unless you're asking question? Oh, okay. We're good. Professor Grandin, it's fantastic to have you around, fantastic to talk to you. I just wanted to ask if there's anybody else who would like to maybe comment or say a few words to Professor Grandin.
Well, I really like this question from Abigail to everybody about the question about hands-on experience. I think we really need to be getting hands-on experience because we're getting a younger generation today that's totally removed from all things practical. Like the girl that didn't know how to use a ruler that was in my class. Never had measured anything with a ruler or a tape measure in her whole life. And we're going to need people to solve problems. We have students today that are terrified of making a mistake. And I think, again, that goes back from being removed from the world of practical. I remember some sewing projects I wrecked. And what I learned from that is I learned to be more careful before I cut the fabric. I ruined a sewing project. I was about 12 years old, wrecked it. We need people to solve problems, and it can't all be done in the abstract. And this gets into another thing I'm working on right now is a book on visual thinking and how we need visual thinkers, where somebody would have said, you know what, you shouldn't have put that big, huge container ship in the Suez Canal, and her bigger sisters are not welcome either. And I didn't put those boats on the Asia Pacific route. Then when a storm tips one of those over, now our containers are floating around as steel icebergs. Yeah, they float right below the surface of the water if they're full of electronics because of the styrofoam. Really dangerous ships.
We should probably have more children in our boards, right? Because they are
We
very
need to be,
logical.
but we've got kids today. This is some of my other stuff. I have a book of my kids' projects I did as a kid, like building kites. This is my outdoor science book for kids, and building kites and things when I was a child. And I had to tinker and tinker to make those kites work. I gave a book signing for this book 3 years ago. 20 to 30% of elementary school children outside of Denver, Colorado had never made a paper airplane in their life. And they made a paper airplane that night in this big theater and they chucked them off the balconies. Totally removed from the practical. And I think this gets back to some of the problems with students being terrified of making mistakes. You do some practical things. I had a teacher ask me in all seriousness, I just couldn't believe it. One of the projects in here is a paper snowflake that you cut out. And I had a teacher ask me in all seriousness, what would happen to the student's self-esteem if the snowflake was cut wrong and it fell apart? And I go, really? You know what? You get another piece of paper, and this is printer paper that's got recycled, another piece of printer paper, and you try again. And then maybe you look it up on YouTube to find out how to do it. Their self-esteem is going to be ruined by cutting a paper snowflake wrong. And this was last year. This is recent. Asking me that in all seriousness. Like, you have got to be kidding. No, we need people. We've got to do some hands-on things. And I was looking up the cameras on the Mars Rover, made by a company, bunch of rock lovers, all geology majors. There's a geology guy with a B.S. in geology who drives the Mars Rover right now. But you know what I also liked? Those cameras have beautiful handmade wiring on them. Somebody made that in a shop. It is mission critical. Let's have some respect for it. They're going to be in my next, those cameras naked without the covers, they're going to be in my, my presentations. Somebody in a shop made those cameras by hand.
Can I just say a quick thank you to Dr. Grandin?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And on
great
behalf
being
of
here, and I'm going to have to go on to another engagement. I want to get some lunch before I go.
Okay, we've in our handling lectures, we've obviously talked a lot about your methods, and everything you explained today just seems like absolute common sense the way you explain it. So thank you so much.
Yep, and then I even got a book, Working with Farm Animals. This is for my small farms. Working with farm animals, a little easy to make portable panel handling facilities in it. So people say, well, all your stuff's for big, gigantic. No, this is my cattle handling right here. Temple Grandin's Guide to Working with Farm Animals for small farms, like, 10 head of cattle, 20 head of cattle, 100 head of sheep, things like that.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to leave and have some lunch and get on to my next engagement. And thank you so much for having me. I just had a great time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. On behalf of everybody here, it was such a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Grandin. We wish you all the best, and we definitely will talk more about this and teach our students how to value the stockmanship, how to be a good.
Well, and stockmanship matters. And stock people don't get paid enough, and it's a skilled job, and it really matters.
Exactly. Yeah. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you
it was
very
fantastic.
Much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to leave the meeting now, and thank you so much for having me. Goodbye. Going to leave the meeting.
Okay, all the best. All the best. Bye.